Good evening, everyone. My name is Andre Copeland. I work for the Chicago Zoological Society, which manages Brookfield Zoo. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening and would like to remind you that we are in webinar format and thus we have everyone's mics mute. Please ensure that your mic is muted so that way we don't disturb this evening's presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will moderate questions for this evening's speakers, and as always, please put your questions in the Q&A box. With that, to start us off, I'd like to introduce the President and CEO of the Chicago Zoological Society, Dr. Stuart Strahl.
Thank you, Andre, for that kind introduction. Yes, for 17 and a half years, I've been the CEO of the Chicago Zoological Society, and this is a special year for us. In February of 1921, a group of leading Chicagoans and the board of the Forest Preserves of Cook County founded the Chicago Zoological Society in order to establish the Chicago Zoological Park and Gardens, which is now called the Brookfield Zoo. We were graced with a bequest from Edith Rockefeller McCormick, who had donated a large tract of land for the purposes of building a modern zoo, one that could teach zoology and kindred subjects, connect people with wildlife and nature, and for the recreation of the people in general. The scientific basis for the Chicago Zoological Society stems back to that time, and we're still connecting people with wildlife and nature, and also trying to get people to understand that we are part of nature and we have an obligation to save wildlife and save wild lands. So tonight, we're going to hear from two conservationists who work for the Vital Ground Foundation, Ryan Luty, who is the CEO, and Mitch Doherty, who is in charge of lands and conservation. I first was involved with the with Vital Ground Foundation through Brian's predecessor, Dr. Gary Wolf, who recruited me onto the board. It seems like about the same time as I started at the Chicago Zoological Society. And it was fortuitous because we were thinking about the biggest exhibit we had built in a long time, Great Bear Wilderness, and also to get people to look at charismatic species and want to not just care about them, but care for them through gifts to our Animal Care and Conservation Fund and through engaging in the field as they could, as several of our bear keepers have done. So we highlight the Vital Ground Foundation and Great Bear Wilderness, and the donations that we've been able to provide them have been very helpful in moving the organization forward. Their mission is to protect and restore North America's grizzly bear populations for future generations by conserving wildlife habitat and also by supporting programs that reduce conflicts between bears and humans. I'd like to say a few words to introduce my friend Ryan Luty, who is the president and CEO of the Vital Ground Foundation. Ryan has a Juris Doctorate from University of Montana. He has been an outdoors person and grew up in the great outdoors in Big Sky Country. He worked for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation for many years, doing conservation work as well, and has a BA in geography and also an English minor. So he's very eloquent in his speech. He got excited about the Vital Ground Foundation because we have a charismatic species in the grizzly bear that people are naturally attracted to. One of the most popular exhibits since the beginning of Brookfield Zoo has been our bear exhibits, because bears are very similar to humans in a lot of their characteristics. And Ryan indeed looks quite like a bear, as you'll see. Ryan's ties to open space have helped set aside tens of thousands of acres, or perhaps hundreds of thousands of acres by now, of conservation easements and of conservation properties. And we're very lucky to have him here tonight and as the CEO of the of the Vital Ground Foundation, one of our closest partners in conservation in North America. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, and Ryan will tell you a little bit about Mitch Doherty, his partner in conservation at Vital Ground, and also about some of the great things we're doing with our strategic plan. I am unabashedly a board member of the Vital Ground Foundation. So Ryan, could you take it from here?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stuart. That was a far more eloquent introduction than I needed. And I'm going to quickly turn and talk about grizzly bears rather than credentials. But I do want to thank CZS and Stuart and Andre and all the attendees tonight for giving us a little time out of your evenings to hear about really our two organizations' collaboration and where we might be headed in the future. We do have a slideshow and a short video towards the end of the presentation to show as part of the program. And then we'll stick around for questions and answers at the end. But I think the first thing that's really important for everyone to know is that CZS and Vital Ground have been stalwart conservation partners since 2006. The Society has contributed more than $125,000 directly to on-the-ground conservation projects supporting the restoration of grizzly bears throughout the Northern Rockies, and cumulatively that support has helped the organization conserve and enhance more than 620,000 acres of wildlife habitat since Vital Ground was founded in 1990. So tonight I'm hoping to provide context on why CZS's investments in Vital Ground are making very meaningful contributions to conservation at the landscape scale, and to make sure that we're all starting with the framework for that discussion. I'd like to take just a couple minutes to provide an overview on the historical and current status of grizzly bears in North America. I'll be focusing for the most part tonight on the lower 48 or conterminous states where Vital Ground conducts the majority of its work, but we do occasionally reach up into Canada and Alaska, where grizzly populations are a little healthier. So to kind of summarize the last couple hundred years in grizzly bear, both presence and management in North America, around the turn of the 20th century, about when Lewis and Clark explored western portions of the United States, 19th century. At that time, the grizzlies range stretched all the way from the northern tip of Alaska, south, well down into Mexico, really occupying again the western portions of the US for the most part. And as many as 50,000 grizzlies likely inhabited the lower 48 or conterminous states at that time. Throughout the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, uncontrolled hunting, trapping, and the outright persecution of carnivores in general reduced the grizzly population in the lower 48 states to only a few hundred animals. And most of those bears were isolated in the wild pockets of habitat that currently comprise places like Glacier National Park, Yellowstone National Park, the Bitterroot-Selway Wilderness, and surrounding areas where it was a little too wild for people to maintain much of a presence. But thanks to listing under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, and then more than 45 years of intensive recovery management by the Fish and Wildlife Service, several different states and tribal governments, grizzlies have recovered to about 4% of their original strength, about 2,000 animals in the lower 48. And probably not coincidentally, those bears do persist on about 4% of the original range that remains available today out of the western half of the continent that they occupied earlier. The vast majority of grizzlies in the lower 48 currently live in and around 6 recovery zones that were federally designated at the time they were listed under the Endangered Species Act. Those recovery zones are illustrated on this map with relative population estimates for each subpopulation being approximately 1,000 bears in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem there in the northeast corner of the map, up by, again, anchored by Glacier Park. Approximately 700 to 750 bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem down there, where Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho all come together in the corner of the map. And then in the Cabinet Yaak and Selkirk Mountains ecosystems, the estimates are about 50 to 60 bears for each of those ecosystems. One of the big outliers are the Bitterroot ecosystem and the North Cascades ecosystem out in Washington, out near the coast. Both of those areas have tremendous, healthy, intact habitat for grizzly bears. But right now, biologists believe there's less than 5 bears in each of those big chunks of ground that, that really could support healthy populations of bears. So those figures, after that much management and all this federal protection, that really does beg the question, what is holding the species back from recovery? And that really has a two-part answer. I'm sure if you attend many CZS lectures, you already know that habitat loss and modification are really primary drivers for reduction in biodiversity globally. Habitat loss obviously leads directly to reductions in both population size and reproductive rates for both common and endangered, more sensitive species. So even though grizzlies have made significant strides toward recovery by Endangered Species Act standards, we'll obviously never see a return to anything close to their historical numbers, thanks to the fact that the majority of their habitat has been converted to human development. Things ranging from towns, cities, a lot of housing and more far-flung development, industrial development, and a lot of the West's transportation infrastructure really does bifurcate lots of good grizzly bear habitat. So there's lots of habitat challenges facing the species. And then additionally, with the increase in human presence, this slide is actually your first pop quiz of the evening. I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes to study it, and everybody has to hazard a guess as to which of these things doesn't belong. Stuart, you're going to have to look really close. I know you've got the biology background, but the answer, of course, in bear country is really none of these things belong on the landscape. We've got everything from trash and bird feeders to pet food, and of course, maintaining chickens, all combine to provide attractants for grizzly bears that bring them in close to people and generally into conflict with people at that time. And when bears come into conflict with people, the bears always lose. Ends badly for the bears. They end up getting trapped. Many times they'll get second chances, they'll be relocated, but often once a bear is food conditioned and learns to associate human activity with food sources, they just cannot correct their course, and they do end up getting euthanized and destroyed and managed out of the population. So again, the two big factors that are depressing bear recovery in the lower 48 these days is just overall human presence and just overutilization of their habitat. So to turn a little bit more to how Vital Ground is pushing back against that continued loss of habitat and how we prevent conflicts between bears and people. I can just say in short, the organization is a regionally focused land trust that uses grizzly bears as a conservation lens through which we focus our resources. I'm betting that most of you have heard, terms in previous lectures like keystone species, indicator species, umbrella species, flagship species, and we could probably host a full night's discussion on assigning different species to those categories. I always like to refer to a good thumbnail synthesis sketch that National Geographic has put together online for a great succinct discussion of how those different categorizations function together. But for our purposes, Vital Ground approaches our work under the premise that grizzlies are an important umbrella species, and the value of an umbrella species is tied to its geographic range. Basically, umbrella species have very large habitat needs, and affecting those outsized habitat requirements either positively or negatively, positively through conservation of swaths of habitat, or negatively through the development, subdivision, and destruction of that habitat can really dramatically impact the many other species, native species that share those habitats. And that's why, again, Vital Ground really does buy into the umbrella species categorization. And that's really where we originated our philosophy that provided the theme for tonight's discussion, that where the grizzly can walk, the earth is healthy and whole. Essentially, conservation of grizzly habitat really does have outsized benefits for the myriad species that share their range. So how do we conduct our work here at Vital Ground? Three primary mechanisms. We do, like most land trusts, transact conservation easements. We work with private landowners to conserve properties that possess high quality grizzly bear habitat, and permanently conserve them through deeded conservation agreements. The other mechanism in our tool bag are fee acquisitions, where the organization just buys habitat in key areas and we manage it for the benefit of wildlife for the long term. Right now, Vital Ground manages just over 2,000 acres between Montana and North Idaho in some of those ecosystems where grizzlies are struggling the most. And then we also like to promote social tolerance of the species through partnership grants. We were fortunate a few years ago to secure some captive funding, and now we've got a great track record each year of collaborating with community-based organizations, groups, local governments to incentivize ways to head off conflicts between grizzlies and people. And I think Mitch is going to give you a highlight in just a little bit about more of those projects. Stuart alluded to it a little earlier, but the way we kind of select our projects, I think it probably is becoming clear that one of the key unifying qualities about both CZS and Vital Ground that make us such great partners is our common grounding in science. What Stuart didn't quite get to was that between 2017 and 2018, as chairman of Vital Ground's board, he helped drive extensive strategic planning sessions that prompted an 18-month roundtable assessment in which Vital Ground convened over 60 state, federal, and tribal grizzly bear biologists and managers, and we asked them two specific questions. First, we asked them to identify and prioritize the lower 48's most important grizzly bear habitat. And then simultaneously, we asked them to identify and prioritize those locations where investments in conflict prevention activities would most increase social tolerance of the species. And through that process, we ended up identifying over 755,000 acres of habitat that is important to grizzlies, with 188,000 acres of that habitat prioritized as absolutely crucial to sustaining the long-term regional recovery of the species. We also identified 84 areas in need of conflict prevention work, with 21 of those prioritized as the most critical for making our investments to keep social tolerance, to keep people providing the space for grizzlies to inhabit the landscape. So what all those dots on the map that you just saw really represent is this region shaded in gray on this map. Again, the ecosystems and recovery zones are in darker purple there. But what really was illustrated by that strategic planning process is that whether you're looking at grizzly conservation from the narrow perspective of the significant habitat requirement that a single bear has, each bear has a home range of multiple hundreds of square miles. Or if you look at grizzly conservation from the broader argument that those several grizzly populations in each one of those highlighted areas. The recovery zones on your map do need to be connected to thwart the effects of genetic isolation, the effects of not being able to commingle and breed with other wild populations of bears, or especially from the panoptic view that all native plant and animal species that share grizzly habitat do need an intact landscape to adapt and evolve and maintain some kind of resiliency in the face of climate change. All of those different perspectives point to the fact that grizzly bear conservation and restoration of the species really does demand a holistic regional approach. It needs to be conducted on a landscape scale in order to be successful. And without question, with more and more people inhabiting grizzly bear's landscape, it needs to address both habitat protection and the social implications of hosting, a large omnivore carnivore in areas with ever increasing demands and presence placed on the species by just humans moving into the area. So to really kind of dive down and delve into how our projects actually look and how the organization operates, I'd love to turn the discussion over to Vital Ground's Conservation Director, Mitch Doherty. He's been with Vital Ground, I think, just over 3 years now. He is got a great planning background with local counties, and he's the guy that took my job of actually getting to go out and meet the landowners and recruit the projects and conduct the transactional work when I moved on up to the executive director's chair. So Mitch will highlight a handful of Vital Ground's current projects and priorities. And with that, I'll turn it over. Mitch, I think you're out there.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Ryan. Good evening, everybody. I don't see anybody, but I know you're all out there. So thanks for joining us tonight. Like Ryan mentioned, I'm the Director of Conservation for the Vital Ground Foundation, and feel very fortunate to be in this role. The work we do is just so important out there in the landscape. And like Ryan mentioned, our work spans that region there that we had in the previous map from, say, Eastern Washington, the Selkirk Mountain Range, across the panhandle of Idaho, majority of Montana, at least the western portion, and into parts of northwest Wyoming. So we work across a pretty broad range of country out here in western United States, and the work we do is just really rewarding. But I wanted to take a little bit of time tonight to share with you, some of the projects we're working on, both currently and in the past, to give you a sense of the work we do and how it kind of comes together and how it can really affect recovery and sustainability of grizzly bears in the long term. And so the first project I wanted to share with you is one that we just got underway here in the last couple of weeks. It's in the northwest part of Montana in the Yak Valley. Some of you may have heard of it before, but you can see on the map here in the slide, there's a little red star that kind of gives you a good sense of where we're at in Montana. I would say it's got to be some of the most remote country out there. A lot of folks in the Yak Valley are living off the grid. It's primarily made up of public land in the valley up there. And so there's not a whole lot of private land, but what is available and held privately is probably the most critical habitat for grizzly bears and other wildlife. And that habitat sits in the valley bottom there. It's those river corridors, riparian areas, and things like that where wildlife really thrive in certain seasons. And so just to kind of give you a sense of the landscape up there, the map you have in front of you shows a couple different shades of color. The green represents public land primarily owned by the Forest Service in the Yak Valley. The orange polygons are what we could call protected private lands, and those lands are primarily encumbered with the conservation easements Ryan talked about earlier. And I should also mention too that Vital Ground is not the only land trust operating throughout Montana and the western United States. We have a lot of great partners out here at other land trusts that do great work, and so some of these orange conservation easements you're seeing are held by some of our partners out there. But then in yellow, the upper part of the map there is what we call the Brody Habitat Preserve, which is a recent acquisition we completed last year about this time that we're managing for wildlife. And that property includes about a mile of river frontage on the Yak River, which is just such a neat place. But the two projects that make up the Fowler Creek acquisition are identified in orange and purple on your map at the bottom there. They make up about 474 acres. So Brian mentioned earlier the assessment we completed in 2018. That is really the foundation and sort of the guide I use to evaluate certain habitat projects that come across my desk and conversations with landowners and things like that. But in the Yak Valley, when we completed that assessment, what we heard from the biologists and bear managers and researchers up there is that this valley bottom habitat is just so important and critical to the recovery and sustainability of grizzly bears. We need to put the energy and capacity we have into protecting what's left of the undeveloped private land up there. And so I should also say, and I suspect folks in your area are experienced as well, but the Western United States right now is seeing quite a bit of development taking place, and the real estate market here is quite active, to say the least. And so the level of threat that we see in the Yak Valley is pretty significant at this point. And so the work we're doing up there, we feel is so important right now. But to share with you, sort of a little bit closer view of the properties we're working on here. There's an aerial map that shows that you can see the riparian area there identified in sort of a brown grayish color, and then it's sort of surrounded by a forested area. It's been well managed. It's undeveloped at this point, except for a residential structure that's midway through construction that's sort of been abandoned. So it's sort of an interesting project in that respect. And what it offers to us is an opportunity to come back into this landscape and do a little bit of habitat restoration work. And so the idea here with this project is we're currently under contract. One of the tools that Ryan mentioned is the fee title acquisition work we do. This is a property that we will be acquiring and holding and managing for wildlife for a certain period of time. And with this project, it's going to have a second phase that will include some habitat restoration work to likely remove those improvements and recreate some of that good wildlife habitat we have there. So we have a budget. These projects are a pretty reasonable lift for an organization of our size. And this project came with a budget of $1.4 million. And so we're currently, we have $1 million raised, and it gave us the confidence to move forward with the contract. And we're in the final phases of trying to raise the last $0.4 million here to complete the acquisition that we're hoping to make happen sometime this spring. So I just want to share with you in these pictures here too, on the property, there's two creeks that run through here, Fowler Creek and Hartman Creek, and the beavers are quite active up in the Yak Valley, and they've created just some amazing habitat. And you can see in the left photo there, one of the beaver ponds that's been created along Fowler Creek. And then on the picture on the right there, we have a peel tree, likely from a black bear, working away out there. And it's amazing, having walked both these properties, the number of peel trees by these black bears is, you can't stand in one area and not see one of these peel trees. They're doing some active forestry work for us. And I just want to mention too that this is a really unique project. We're fundraising and purchasing the property identified in purple, and the landowners to the north, they are actually also neighbors to the Brody Preserve I had mentioned earlier that was identified in yellow. They have the adjacent property up there. When they learned we were looking at this property here on Fowler Creek and found out they were again going to be our neighbors, they reached out to the Vital Ground Foundation and offered to donate their 160 acres to our organization. And part of that is because they really have a shared vision for wildlife and management with Vital Ground in the Yak Valley. And they've come to a point in their life where, they're looking at sort of the next steps and things like that for land management, and knowing that this is 160 acres, it's undeveloped. They really felt like Vital Ground was positioned well to be good caretakers of that property from here on out. And so we're working with them on a donation of that 160 acres probably this summer. So in total, we're going to have 474 acres there that we'll be managing for wildlife in the Yak Valley. So another important part of our work is the linkage work we do. And if you think back to the map we saw earlier with all the dots on it in between those ecosystems, those dots that lie in between those ecosystems really represent the linkage work that can be done out on the landscape. And when we talk about linkage, we talk about connecting these ecosystems. And it's so important for grizzly bears and other wildlife species to have those connected ecosystems and not live in these islands. And so Vital Ground has sort of a unique role in the land trust community where we are willing and actively pursue smaller projects that really support linking these important habitats. And here's two examples of, recent linkage projects we've completed. And the project on your left is dubbed the 9 Mile Crossing. And so what you're looking at there is Interstate 90, a bridge that spans the Clark Fork River. Vital Ground in 2017, I believe, we worked to acquire 52 acres right there adjacent to the interstate. And the reason for that is in speaking with the biologists and the bear managers in the area, we learned that elk and also a grizzly bear, one of the most famous grizzly bears, Ethel, crossed through this property and used some flat area under that bridge to get under Interstate 90, which is just a major barrier to wildlife movement. And so what we've done here is acquired the 52 acres. We're holding it, managing it for wildlife with the idea that with the security that's provided with the lack of improvements in development there, wildlife will feel safe to move underneath the interstate. And what we see here is sort of a low cost investment for supporting wildlife movement across these highways, which are major barriers. I'm sure folks are familiar with some of the really great looking wildlife overpasses and things like that. And we certainly would love opportunities to work on projects like that, but recognizing they cost millions of dollars and take quite a bit of time and commitment and capacity from agencies and other partners, we saw an opportunity here where we could make sort of a small investment and provide that security for wildlife to move under the interstate. So and then on the right there, the photo of the Wild River project is a 4-phase project that we sort of wrapped up just this last year with our final acquisition there. But it started in 2011 with a 70+ acre acquisition on one side of Highway 2. And apologies, it's hard to see the highway on this image here, but it basically transects the kind of open area you see there. So in 2011, Vital Ground partnered with the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative and acquired 70+ acres on the north side of Highway 2. And Highway 2, I should mention, is the same highway that runs across the United States. It goes on the southern edge of Glacier National Park there, so folks might be familiar with it. This part of Montana doesn't see as much traffic, but it's still a major impediment to wildlife movement. So following that acquisition on the north side in 2011, Vital Ground again partnered with the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, and in roughly 4 phases acquired what was essentially a defunct subdivision here. It was platted as 20+ lots. Fortunately and unfortunately for some, the recession came in 2008, and those platted lots sort of sat vacant for a number of years up until about 2016, when we stepped in and started working on negotiations and contracts to slowly start acquiring those parcels. And so what we've done over those 4 phases of acquisitions is sort of consolidated those subdivided plats into one large tract again to secure what's a really important wildlife corridor. And the part that I missed earlier on, that there is really limited opportunities in this part of Montana for wildlife connectivity, and that's primarily due to development and topography. And so working with the biologists, we really keyed in on this Wild River area as one of the last remaining linkage areas in the area. And just so happened last year, the year before, our land steward, Kaylee Becker, managed to bump into a grizzly bear over there as well. And the neighbors also saw him spending some time down there too. So we know it's getting good use. And again, this is going to support not only recovery and sustainability for bears in the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem, but the vision is that bears that are moving through this corridor here will continue to move south and hopefully make it to some of those less populated areas, including the Bitterroot ecosystem. And so I wanted to kind of give you a different perspective on an active project we're working on that really supports linkage. And so this is in an area just further south there from where we were looking at Wild River. And so the way the highways are set up in Montana, we have Highway 2 to the north, Highway 200 just below. And so if a bear makes it through our Wild River project, he's going to travel about 75 miles and bump into Highway 200. And so again, with our partners at Yellowstone and Yukon Initiative, when we wrapped up the Wild River project, we immediately bumped south to Highway 200 to look for our next opportunity there. And again, this place was shown to us through that HCIP assessment. We don't just go out willy-nilly and pick areas. This is, where the biologists, the researchers that are really working on recovery and sustainability of bears are pointing us. And so the idea here again is that we're going to support that linkage north-south between the Cabinet Yaak, the Northern Continental Divide, and hopefully to the Bitterroot ecosystem someday. And so right now we're working on an 80-acre acquisition here. Again, this is a fee title acquisition, not a conservation easement. And it's shown here in the hatched area, but you can really get a good sense of the bottleneck that we're working with here. And we kind of strategically look for these types of areas where we're anchored by public land on either side, and then we can see that narrow pathway there. And in this instance here, we're sort of looking hard at opportunities with the 4 parcels identified in pink. Unfortunately, we're gonna hopefully have the contract in place here at the end of the week for this 80-acre track. But the idea here is we'll continue to work with the adjacent landowners, playing a conservation long game strategy here that eventually over time we'll be able to either purchase those properties or hopefully secure a conservation easement that will allow those folks to continue to live there, own and manage the property the way they want, but provide or deed us the rights to subdivision there so we can ensure that habitat remains intact. So again, it's a really, really important project. Our budget here is about $550,000. And you kind of get the sense about the future acquisitions and how we're piecing together this linkage area here. And then the last project I wanted to share with you is one we recently completed about 2-3 weeks ago. And this is our Glacier Gateway project. It's located right at the doorsteps of Glacier National Park on the western edge there. So for folks that have been to Glacier National Park, the North Fork of the Flathead River is basically the border for Glacier National Park. And the North Fork Road runs from Highway 2 to the Canadian border there. Everything on the east side of the North Fork River is Glacier National Park, and everything on the west is private and public land. And so this is a really unique project where we partnered with the Forest Service to help them acquire a 10-acre tract right at the doorstep of Glacier National Park. And so again, I think in this real estate market and in Western Montana in general, we're seeing a high level of development taking place right now, and especially in very remote and rural areas like the North Fork. And I should also say the North Fork is one of these areas where folks are living off the grid. You can go to the local tavern, you can go to the bakery, but you should know that every huckleberry bear claw you eat is made with solar power and things like that. So it's a really neat place. And it's quite the attraction for a lot of folks going to the park there. But what's also unique about it is that the North Fork of the Flathead River was designated as a scenic river. And so it comes with these special rules and regulations as well for development. And so the Forest Service, when we reached out to them about an opportunity to potentially protect this parcel, they were ecstatic about that opportunity and jumped right on it. And the way this project came together from a financial standpoint is through the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And so the Land and Water Conservation Fund is made up of offshore drilling and oil royalties. And so that money is then used to protect habitat, enhance habitat, restore habitat across the United States. And so the Flathead National Forest was able to obtain some of those LWCF funds to use to purchase this property. And so the role of Vital Ground plays in an acquisition like this is sort of a facilitator. We help negotiate the contract. We help pay for some of the due diligence and transactional costs. But in the end, this parcel becomes a piece of U.S. Forest Service land that's available to all folks across the United States to use and enjoy, and some spectacular views of the park there as well. And lastly, I want to talk about our Partners Grant Program. And Ryan alluded to this earlier, but this is our program that really focuses on conflict prevention between bears and humans. And so to date, since 1995, we've been able to distribute $850,000 in grants to help these communities deal with human-bear conflicts. And so we've been able to reach 130 different communities and organizations across Alaska, British Columbia, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And the types of tools that folks are using on the ground include electric fencing of chicken coops and orchards and gardens and things like that. We have range rider programs where in more egg-based communities, we have folks that are willing to go out and ride either on horseback or on four-wheelers and sort of report on activities they're seeing out there from both bears and wolves and even mountain lions as well. And so those range riders are really important in some of these watersheds where they can report back to the community about some of the issues they're seeing. And they also help with programs like carcass pickup. And so if some stock die from winter kill or something like that, what they do, the range riders and the biologists and the landowners essentially go out there and remove that carcass to help get that attractant off the landscape. So bears and wolves are not in there causing trouble later on with some of the other livestock. Our program also helps support education and outreach events. These are bear fairs, bear spray training events, things like that across the region. We also have had some of the funds help some other organizations with some land protection projects that are going to reduce conflicts between humans and bears. Fruit gleaning programs. So in certain communities, orchards, fruit trees are attractant for black bears primarily, and ultimately grizzly bears as well. And so some small communities and organizations have put together fruit gleaning programs where they'll help landowners get that fruit off the tree before it becomes a problem with bears. And then lastly, bear resistant trash cans are a big part of our program. So we're working with communities, agency partners and tribes to help get bear resistant trash cans out on the landscape. And so couple images here, the local garbage man there in the city of Troy. Oh no, wait, that's Stuart. Got a picture there. We helped the community of Troy fence that sanitation facility. So it's the local dump, and they were having issues with black bears up there. And it was only a matter of time before grizzly bears were coming into the community and getting into the dump. And so what they did was fenced it off and electrified it, and got a great shot of Stuart, and they even put a plaque up for us. In the top photo, some of our partners at the Swan Valley Connections working on electric fencing for some goats. And then the bottom image shows one of the bear fair events with one of the persons practicing their bear spray deployment on a charging or a bluff charging bear, we'll say. So it's a really great program. And like Ryan mentioned, we have captive funding for that for a bit more time here. And I think it's a really good opportunity for Vital Ground to be working closely with some of these communities and with organizations that are out there on the ground. So I think that was all I had for this evening, Ryan. And I think you wanted to talk a little bit about the video we wanted to share with folks.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a bunch, Mitch. And I regarding that last slide, I say it at every presentation, and no one has challenged me yet, but I think Vital Ground might be the only land trust in the nation that has a city community dump dedicated in its name. So we're pretty proud of that fact. You know, again, from all the good it's doing, that collection site is located immediately across the street from the city's elementary school. So it is a place that, again, grizzly bears have no business being attracted to. So it was great to get Stuart up there and show him some of the good work that CZS has helped us complete. So we didn't mention it before, but Vital Ground is governed by an all-volunteer board of directors that live all over the nation, all the way from Alaska to California, down into Florida, Maine. We've got just about the entire country represented on our board. And by the same token, lots of different skill sets and interests, and not all of our board is biologically trained. They don't all have PhDs in wildlife biology like Stuart and a couple others. Lots of folks are brought to the organization because of the, just the emotional presence that, a big charismatic megafauna like grizzly bears have. And they really, do translate conservation more through an emotional filter than the hard science data filter. So we did make a conscious effort as we completed the conservation strategic plan that Mitch and I just presented on. We wanted to translate all that into, something that appeals more to the left brain folks. And we'd like to present that video tonight. And with a little luck from the elves that rule the information technologies realm, we'll show that video, and then Mitch and I will stick around for questions.
The crown of the continent, 250 miles of mostly intact wild country, is the backbone of the world. It's what the Blackfeet call it. It has one of the most intact wildlife communities on the globe. It's bigger and older and more inspiring than any one of us can hope to be, I think. Big as this country looks, these mountain ranges are becoming islands in a sea of human activity. Because animals need that freedom to roam, to adjust, adapt, perhaps more than ever. It's getting pretty hot out there. They run against these barriers and they get stuck where they are. That's why animals disappear on islands. They have no place to go. In 30 years, with plenty of partners, we've set aside close to 650,000 acres of prime wildlife habitat. 650,000 acres, but it's not all connected. One landscape is simply a knitting together of the strongholds that remain. The bears showed us where they should go. And if we can build wildlife corridors, connectivity between these remaining strongholds of wildlife, it will hold up over time.
The lower elevations, which are kind of bottlenecks for key species like grizzly bear, there just aren't many left. Almost all of it's private owned. And so there is that constant pressure to divide and develop land. Where Vital Ground has their most important role here is putting together conservation easement projects and in those really key critical areas.
Many feel as I do that we're very fortunate to live in a place where bears exist We do have a lot of wildlife come through. Plus, it's been productive farm ground for well over a century. I want it to remain not only in agriculture, but also as good habitat for wildlife. Because where the bears roam, there is still good habitat. I felt also that my grandfather would appreciate this property staying in one piece and functioning much as it is today.
Oh, estate planning, my legacy, what's going to happen. That's what I think about at 3 o'clock in the morning, for sure. For me, it's really important to have a direction of where this goes, you know, for the next generation and the generations to come. With this in easement like it is, we know where it's going to go.
In the last several years, we've had lots of documented grizzly bears coming through the property and some staying on the property. We don't see them so much as we know that they're here. But it's just knowing that they're out there that I like. It makes my life better. We appreciate all the work Vital Ground does. Getting these conservation easements and putting in place in perpetuity, I like that we quietly do our job and it lasts forever.
So when we say we're saving nature, what do we really mean? When I go out and walk on the ground that Vital Ground has protected, and we all had a role in, and I'm looking at elk tracks, I'm seeing grizzly scratches on the trees. Vital Ground is making that real. This is saving nature on a large scale and connected scale. That'll work.
So I'm sorry, the video was a little jerky there. If you would like to see it in its entirety, you can jump on Vital Ground's website at just vitalground.org, and it's the first landing page you come to has the video on it. And again, just before we jump into questions tonight, I just kind of like to close with you know, the observation. There's obviously no shortage of dire emergent issues, environmental issues in need of attention at this time. But grizzlies are right now simply at a turning point where the human impacts on their environment, especially the intense subdivision and development pressure we're seeing here in the Northern Rockies, is threatening to foreclose the last remaining opportunities to maintain wildlife connectivity and resiliency to climate change across this landscape. And you know, we've got to keep in mind this is occurring in the only remaining portion of the United States that still hosts the array of native plants and wildlife species that were present at the turn of the 19th century. We're super thankful that CZS has joined us in our commitment to protecting that. So we really appreciate, again, your time tonight and your partnership these many years. Thank you very much.
Well, you are very welcome, and thank you for everything that you're doing. It's really exciting to hear about the hope that you're providing for grizzly bears. And one of the questions that we had was when you were talking about some of the regions that these bears are living in, was how many bears can live in these regions? Or how many bears can these regions sustain would be a more appropriate question.
Sure. Well, I think, you know, that question needs to be analyzed both from the perspective of, you know, the habitat, the biological carrying capacity of the region, as well as the social carrying capacity of each region. And when I was kind of running through the numbers earlier, I mentioned that the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem around Glacier Park and the Yellowstone ecosystem both have several hundred bears. Again, in NCD's case, it's up over 1,000. In the Yellowstone, probably somewhere just south of 800 bears. And in both of those ecosystems, you know, great chunks of habitat. The bear populations have significant protections and anchor points there. But what we're seeing in both of those ecosystems is as more bears do show up, there's more and more conflicts with people. And I think in particular to those two areas, you know, we are seeing a situation where ultimately the social carrying capacity of the region is going to determine, a cap, so to speak, on those populations. So I would say in both areas, they've attained a recovered status, so to speak, and there's going to be an ebb and flow. Good years when we have lots of nice wet weather and lots of grass and prey bases, prey species are high. There's a lot less conflict with people because their bears aren't out searching for food and going to those uncontained garbage areas or the fruit orchards that haven't been harvested. So I do kind of feel like we're reaching social carrying capacity in those areas. But in contrast, when you look over to the Cabinet Yaak and Selkirk Mountains ecosystems, just a couple dozen bears in each of those ecosystems. Conflicts are intensive. Conflict attractants are intensively managed because in each of those ecosystems, every bear mortality really counts a little more against the recovery of the species, because every bear represents a more significant portion of the population. So in those ecosystems, there's definitely room for significant growth. The habitat is there, and it's just a matter of kind of getting the population's legs under them, so to speak, and getting enough bears where they can reach a reproduction rate to fully populate, several hundred bears in each of those ecosystems. And then on the far end of the spectrum, again, out in the North Cascades and in the Bitterroot Selway ecosystem, there's hardly any bears, and there's just absolutely tremendous habitat in both areas. Folks may remember, just as of a couple of years ago, they were discussing reintroducing grizzly bears in the North Cascades area. And right now, the social tolerance doesn't appear to support a very strong reintroduction effort, but there was strong support for bringing grizzly bears back as an element of the ecosystem. And I think, one of the things that as more attention is paid to what it really takes to subsist, to live with bears, in your backyard, I think that's going to go a long ways towards changing the public attitudes and allowing those areas to host more and more bears. So yeah, it's definitely a case by case basis, but I'd say the further west you go in the United States, the more opportunity or more capacity there is for increasing bear numbers.
As you were talking about the conflict between bears and people, and the fact that some of the bears end up being labeled nuisance bears and actually, when they're relocated, return to the area that they become nuisance bears. I was wondering if you could talk to us about how these bears are marked or tagged, and maybe how often they do return to an area that they've been removed from.
Sure. It's again, that's going to be a case by case analysis, but for the most part, I think if I could channel a grizzly bear manager, which I'm not, no one at Vital Ground actually assumes that role, but those managers we work with really do spend probably more time managing people than they do managing bears. And so every conflict is unique. If you have a landowner that is really reticent to address the attractant issue on their property, he can create, or that person can create a chronic problem, not just for the bear that finds that conflict or that attractant, but for all the bears in the area. It's just a big draw and can become quite a mortality sink for bears. So I would say every case needs to be analyzed, but from a time a bear is trapped and handled and relocated, at a minimum, it's a safe bet that they are going to get an ear tag, a visual identifier marking of some kind, so that in case they show up again at that location or another location, the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service can keep track of those bears. And from there, the technology really does ramp up. They've got both radio telemetry collars and GPS collars where they can track bears, either by flying with their telemetry equipment and locating the bear and marking its tracking its location on a periodic basis that way, or some of the GPS collars, can track up to 10-minute increments and almost provide real-time tracking of the bears. Those collars, the more technology in them, the more expensive they get. So they don't just have a pickup truck full of those that they can drive around and issue as needed on bears. It's more of an opportunistic thing, but every bear that they do handle and put a collar on just provides a wealth of information regarding the animal's behavior and the species habitat needs. They can really start to parse down into what bears are looking for, what's affecting their movement, where they're ending up, and so the more technology they can dangle off a bear, the more information they get. But I know you can also make a flip side argument that that may affect the bear's behavior. The more they get handled, the more equipment they put on them. Are you still watching and tracking a true wild bear in its habitat? So, and not to mention that a lot of the bears that they do end up handling are bears that were brought into conflict with people by an artificial human created attractant. So something external to the bear's habitat needs affected its behavior, and so you have to watch for that as well. But really fascinating. Fish and Wildlife Service hosts periodic meetings out here. If you look up the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee's website, they put their ecosystem recovery zone reports online, and just makes for fascinating reading if folks want to dive deeper into that topic.
Excellent. During the program, there was an acronym that was used. It's HCIP. And I was wondering if you could tell us what that actually stands for.
Mitch, you want to grab that one?
Certainly. So that was the assessment we referred to that we worked on in 2018 with the biologists and bear managers with the tribes and the agencies. So HCIP stands for Habitat and Conflict Inventory and Prioritization.
Okay. Now, once you've identified land and there's an easement on the land, or you've actually purchased the land, do you do anything to maintain it, like remove invasive species, maintain the land in other areas, or do you just leave the land as it is?
That's a great question. Vital Ground wants to be the best neighbor we can. Oftentimes, we have, neighbors who are farmers and ranchers. We have neighbors who live there year round. We have neighbors who are seasonal residents. And so what we do with the land we own and manage is we are active managers of the land. And so we will address, noxious weeds. If there's any veg management that needs to take place, we'll certainly address that. And in some instances, I mentioned the Wild River Project earlier. The property on the north side of that road there did have some infrastructure, a home, several outbuildings, pretty dilapidated. But what we did there was actually remove those structures and then restore that landscape. And so it runs the full gamut. We're currently partnering with Kootenai Tribes of Idaho and the Forest Service and Montana State Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to restore the other side of the Wild River Project, doing some in-stream work to support a sturgeon habitat there, another endangered species. So we're not just working on the terrestrial part of it in the upland, we're also willing to partner on stuff in stream as well.
So when you go into these areas, because I know that you had mentioned this before and you just touched upon it again, you're helping other species as well. So you just mentioned the sturgeon, and are there any other species you might be able to talk to us about that benefit from the things that you're doing to help grizzly bears?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like Ryan mentioned, as an umbrella species, we like to believe that a lot of other species benefit from our work as well. But it goes beyond just the animal species as well. The native plants are really an important part of the ecosystem. And so over on the Kootenai, we're working with a landowner right now to create stopover habitat, or I like to call them oasis. But what's happening there is we're working on a 1,000-acre conservation easement that is in the Kootenai Valley. And for folks that aren't familiar with the area, the Kootenai Valley is a very heavily industrialized agricultural valley. And so the Budweiser farm is up there. They're growing hops for Budweiser. There's canola fields and things like that. And a lot of folks are probably asking themselves, why is that important to an organization like Vital Ground? And the reason is that valley separates the Selkirk ecosystem from the Cabinet Yaak. And to have that connectivity, we need to have wildlife moving across that valley. And these stopover areas, we're working with Fish and Wildlife Service and the tribe to help create, are not going to just support grizzly bear movement across the valley, which is about 5 miles wide in some areas. It's really going to support elk and other ungulates as well, because it's part of a migration area for elk, and it's also winter range as well. So that's where our partners really came on board and said, hey, we recognize you guys are working on this from a grizzly bear perspective, but would you be willing to talk with that landowner about removing some of his land from the agricultural piece and converting it to wildlife habitat? And the work we're doing, I don't know if it's inspiring enough, but these landowners are willing to take a portion of their livelihood and convert that from canola to wildlife habitat, which I think is just fantastic.
Excellent. So are you hopeful about the future of grizzly bears and some of the other animals within these habitats?
I personally am. I think we're seeing, like Ryan mentioned earlier, with recovery, we're starting to see, the populations really in the greater Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, reach their carrying capacity, and those bears are starting to disperse far and wide. And folks that are tracking the news are seeing, these bears really reaching far parts of eastern Montana that are not expecting to see bears, and same for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And the idea between those two ecosystems, if we can get connectivity really and bears and other wildlife flowing there, I think that's really the key to success. But I'm feeling pretty good about where we're at right now, but I'd love to hear from Ryan on that too.
Yeah, no, I'd echo what Mitch said. I think one of the most telling indicators I have is that the state of Montana over the last year pulled together a statewide grizzly bear advisory committee under the previous administration. And through that, the former governor brought together landowners, ranchers, farmers, sportsmen, some industry, biologists, and they convened about a year-long analysis on, as grizzly bears recover, what is it going to take to make sure that they stay, an integral part of Montana's landscape. And as part of that, they did a pretty broad study of public attitudes in Montana, found out there was tremendous support for having bears, grizzlies, as part of our life out here in Montana. And nobody wanted to see them actively hunted or diminished, even in those areas where their recovery levels are quite high at this point. So, I think, again, the habitat exists. We need to focus on really buffering and connecting it from Vital Ground's perspective. And then from that point on, it's really going to be a social issue, making sure that communities get the resources they need to address problems when they crop up and to head them off before they do. So yeah, we're definitely very optimistic that grizzly bears do have a sustainable future throughout the region.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. And you said that there were about 2,000 grizzlies. Now, is that in the lower 48, or does that include Alaska and Canada as well?
No, that again is just in the lower 48 states. I don't have current figures for Canada, but I know Alaska numbers, the kind of anchor that folks typically throw out is about 30,000 bears, coastal and interior grizzlies up there in Alaska. So, doing much better where people have not as dramatically encroached into their habitat. So.
Now, we have people that want to get involved and help out, really are inspired about what you're talking about this evening. So what can people do? Are there opportunities for people to volunteer or maybe be on the board, or are there other ways for people to get involved?
For sure. I mean, I would again just recommend start by getting to know Vital Ground by coming to our website at vitalground.org and definitely reach out. You know, we're a pretty small staff, and you've got about a quarter of us here on this call, a third of us with Kevin in the background there. So we're here to answer phones and answer questions. And from there, you know, on the ground opportunities, because our work is so far flung over, you know, a tri-state area, it really is hard to coordinate that, but we do host periodic tours that we call walks on vital ground with our board and other volunteers. And obviously in this time of COVID, we've put those on hold for a bit, but very optimistic that we'll be coming back in future years. And so definitely opportunities to come out and visit Grizzly Country with us. So plug in through the website and feel free to reach out as you feel ready to do so.
Excellent. Now, is the current administration in Washington supportive of your efforts? And do you receive any federal funding to help with what you're doing?
So definitely Vital Ground taps into different federal funding programs for our projects. Our operations are nearly all 100% privately supported, but many of the large conservation easements, such as the agricultural land easement program through the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the U.S. Forest Services Forest Legacy Program are two real large pots of funding that Vital Ground has been able to roll out on the ground to incentivize conservation easements with landowners who have, you know, working farmland, working forest land, where they can make a little space for wildlife and make sure that those properties stay, you know, in agriculture or forestry, which is far preferable to having it subdivided and developed for housing or other inappropriate or uses that are incompatible with wildlife habitat. So again, land and water conservation funding is critical to our work. That Glacier Gateway project that Mitch just talked about was anchored by LWCF funding in partnership with Forest Service. And so the organization's work is very dependent on those programs for sure. So supporting federal programs that promote, you know, outdoor recreation, open space on working farm and forest lands is very important.
Now, I know we've been talking a lot about grizzly bears, but wanted to find out if black bears are in trouble as well, or if their populations are so far sustainable.
Yeah, for the most part, in Montana, Idaho, there are lots and lots of black bears, and they do tend to have the same conflicts that grizzlies do with people out here, and I'm sure you guys see that back home as well. But for the most part, no issues with their population trends here in the Northwest.
Okay. Now, I was also wondering if there's any possible way or plans to connect the Continental Divide to the Yellowstone ecosystem to establish a broader corridor to help grizzly bears.
Yeah, that was a large part of the analysis of our HCIP assessment. We did basically delve down into different categories of conservation projects. You know, we looked at core habitat projects inside wilderness areas, inside national forests, private in-holdings, things like that. We looked at projects to buffer those secure state and federal habitat lands, and then really spent a lot of time on linkage projects like the 9 Mile linkage and the Wild River linkage that Mitch was talking about. And again, just with the transportation corridors, you know, here in the West, overlapping, you know, the highways, the railroads, often they occupy the same ground as a river, valley, all provide movement barriers to wildlife, not just grizzlies, but to many wildlife species, and making sure that we have some secure blocks of habitat crossing, all of those challenges is very important. And that was a big part of our analysis.
You know, as you're doing these analysis and then you're finding areas that you need to use for linkage zones, do you find opposition once you've targeted an area? For example, are there real estate groups or developers that don't want you to, section off this land for bears?
Sure. We've been pretty fortunate, in the fact that our work really is incentive based. It's not based on regulatory mechanisms. We're not approaching it from the perspective that you must do this. It's from the perspective that nearly every county we work in has some kind of comprehensive plan that recognizes the value of open space, wildlife habitat, working farm and ranch lands as benefits and amenities to their county. And we're pretty darn careful about not trying to conduct conservation projects right on the edge of town where it might be more appropriately used for development purposes. We are really, for the most part, grizzly habitat is pretty wild country, and for the most part we're working out in areas where intensive subdivision and development is inappropriate for multiple reasons, not just because it compromises grizzly bear habitat, but also because it's really hard for counties to service in terms of fire protection, the ambulance services, snow plowing, the other infrastructure that gets really expensive for counties, cities and counties to provide the farther it gets from, where the majority of people are living. So we've been pretty careful and fortunate in that regard.
Now, I know that in efforts to keep people connected, some of the roadways that we use to connect ourselves actually are perilous for bears. And I hear that in Yellowstone, that conflict between vehicles and grizzly bears are, some of the causes for grizzly bear mortality there. And I was wondering if there's anything that you all are doing to help bears cross roadways within the Yellowstone area.
Not specifically in the Yellowstone area, Andre, but, closer to home here in Missoula and Western Montana, I participate in a few stakeholder groups where our focus is connectivity and transportation. And recently the state of Montana put together and hosted a transportation wildlife summit 2 years ago. And so Vital Ground was part of that. We continue to participate in those conversations, and we see ourselves as playing a role as sort of the land guys in that. And so when you think about a crossing or an impediment to crossing the highway there, our role in that situation is working with our partners at the Department of Transportation, other NGOs, to secure habitat probably on either side of that transportation route, and then work with them to sort of design what the either overpass or underpass might look like. And several of those conversations are going on right now, both on Interstate 90, Highway 93 that runs from Glacier National Park south. We did experience several significant mortalities on Highway 93 last year, and the result of that is going to be an underpass or an overpass. Just because that amount of take for a teeny species is not tolerable, according to Fish and Wildlife Service. And so the department, the transportation, is able to step in and make those types of crossing structures happen. And the same can be said for bighorn sheep, even frogs, turtles, and things like that that are on the endangered species list. So Vital Ground certainly plays a role, but it's part of a larger conversation with our partners.
Thank you. One of our guests said that they read a 2002 article in Ursus Bear Reintroduction. And the article stated that if you transplant a black bear sow that's either impregnated or with cubs, there's a higher survival rate for the sow and the cubs. So they were wondering if you found anything similar with grizzly bears.
Well, I think that's a little outside of both Mitch and my wheelhouses. You know, the only comment I guess I could make on point on that is, you know, it's really unfortunate when there is a tough habitat year here in a region, whether it's dry or a berry crop fails. Um, the sow, when a sow comes into conflict with people and starts teaching her cubs from an early age that people, you know, can be associated with food sources, it's usually a pretty big tragedy for the cubs as well, because that learned behavior is permanently ingrained and there's almost no correcting that. So yeah, I mean, there's no question that all of that learning, that habitat learning and the survival learning that happens in the first year, 2, 3 years that a sow is bonding and teaching its offspring is just critically important for them to stay out of trouble, stay away from people, and you know, you learn how to use the habitat safely if they're close to a highway or something. And you know, a great example of that would be the success that a lot of grizzly bear enthusiasts know about Bear 399 in Yellowstone, on the edge of Yellowstone down there. Tom Mangelson, world-renowned wildlife photography, a photographer who's also a great supporter of Vital Ground, has actually produced a coffee table book, for lack of a better word, full of great pictures and stories on grizzly number 399, who has had an incredibly high success rate at raising offspring, you know, at least until she was ready to breed again, because she knew how to thread the needle when it came to, you know, living around a lot of people down there utilizing that Yellowstone area. So that would be a fascinating read on point on that question.
Right. Well, I want to thank all three of you this evening. I know people weren't able to see Kevin, who is the producer and running all the tech for you. But Ryan, Mitch, really want to thank you for joining us this evening. And one thing I do want to say is that your project, your program, acts as an inspiration for a lot of us here in Illinois that are working with the Illinois Monarch Project, because what you're doing for grizzly bears can act as a roadmap to help all of us who are in the migratory pathway of the monarchs, realizing the importance of habitat connectivity. So a lot of the things that you're doing, we can apply here. So we really appreciate you paving the way for us. And we really appreciate all of you joining us this evening and hope that you consider joining us for our spring lecture series, which begins on April 14th. As always, we thank you for joining us. Be safe, be well. Everyone, have a great evening.